Hello and welcome to my channel, and this is my January 2022 wrap-up video. So in this video I'll be talking about all of the books that I finished in January, last month, and yeah, in total I finished 11 books. So I think that this video is going to be fairly long, and because it is going to be long, or rather I expect it to be long, I think it's highly likely that it's going to be long. Because of my propensity to talk nonsense. I will include timestamps in the description box below. So if you are interested in hearing me talking about any particular book, then feel free to head on to the description box and click on the books. And and also I think 11 books is that is a fairly big quantity that I don't think I have ever done in my entire life before, and I don't think that I will replicate that number in future months. At least in February I don't think that I'll be able to do that, because 11 is fairly long, fairly big number. So but to be fair, I actually read some smaller books as well. So, it's not like I read 11 tomes. But yeah, let's get to the first book that I finished in January, and that would be The Gift of Rain by Twan. So Twan is a Malaysian author, and this would be the second book of his that I've read. And The Gift of Rain is about this young man who lives in 1940s Malaya before and during the Japanese occupation. So this young man's name is Philip, and he is someone of a mixed Chinese-British heritage. And this is going to be a very important detail in this book, because what this book is about is basically how he navigates his own identity, and it is going to be sort of put to a test when Philip befriends a slightly older Japanese man named Endo, with whom he becomes a very close friend of, and Endo would eventually teaches him how to practice martial arts, because apparently, according to Endo, that is going to be very important to him later on. And in this book, the important cultural context to know is that at that time, sometime around the late 30s in Malaya, there is actually this kind of I would say enmity between the Chinese and the Japanese, because of what happens between China and Japan around that time. When Japan attacks China and they have war with each other, and so that sentiment sort of spread to places like Malaya, of course, in which the Chinese diaspora also have some kind of hostility hostile sentiments towards the Japanese, and it is sort of reciprocated by the Japanese as well. And so it got somewhat complicated for someone, a part Chinese, part British like Philip, to become close friends with the Japanese like Endo, and that is going to sort of become the complication in this book, where Philip would eventually have to choose, when the Japanese eventually invaded Malaya, and we know that because we live in the 21st century. When the Japanese eventually invades Malaya, Philip will have to choose whether he wants to place his loyalty on his friend, his best friend, or his loyalty on his family, his community, or his home country. And it's a really interesting book about choice, and also how this choice is sort of something that the protagonist gets to navigate in his own interesting way, considering his own interesting background. and how choices are made and how people don't necessarily understand other people's choices and decisions and stuff like that. So it's an interesting book, of a fairly nice read. I do find that certain parts of Asian culture is described as sort of mythical in a sense, which to me it is sort of weird, because the author himself is Asian, he's Malaysian, and sometimes it does feel like the writing in this book is sort of tailored towards a Western audience who would probably have some kind of certain expectation on what Asian culture is. Now, one thing I want to mention about this book is, this is an element that is downplayed by most reviews I've seen, and that is the queer subtext, or I would say it's not even a subtext, it's the queer element in this book. Basically, the relationship between Philip and his friend, which I think is very much a romantic relationship, but it is not explicitly mentioned. But if you are familiar with, I would say, writings in queer literature or gay literature, you would see that certain language is being employed in this novel, especially on how on how it describes Philip's difficult relationship with Endo due to his cultural background, the cultural atmosphere at that time. The kind of language that is being used also kind of like doubles, to imply that there is another layer to their relationship. And I personally think that this kind of reading would actually enrich. It doesn't take away from the historical reading or the cultural reading of this book. So I definitely disagree with how some reviews says that this book is not a gay fiction. It is just a historical fiction featuring people being friends. But yeah, if you're interested, feel free to try this one and let me know what you think about that. And so I am going to move on to the next book I finished, which was Faces in the Water by New Zealand author Janet Frame. So this book was published in 1961, and it talks about this protagonist named Istina. And Istina is a young woman in her 20s, and she has been living in psychiatric facilities in New Zealand. And in this book, which is set over the span of 8 years, we see how Istina is transferred to different psychiatric facilities, and how she is sort of located and relocated in different wards, and how she sort of details her experience, what she sees in these different wards, and what she sees with the patients, how she describes the patients and the treatments that they receive, and how the medical staff treats the patients in these mental health facilities. So this book, it was published in the 60s, and if I were to guess, this story is set sometime around probably around 1940s to 1950s. It is not explicitly mentioned when it is taking place, so I just made that conjecture based on the author's own personal life, because the author is born sometime around the 1920s. So the protagonist being a 20-year-old character, 1940s would sort of make sense, I think. And this book is not exactly autobiographical, but I think a lot of it sort of draws inspiration from the authors herself, from her own experience being in a mental health facility when she's a young woman herself. And so this book, not only it talks about all of those experiences, but at the same time it also talks about this kind of lingering fear and worry that certain, I would say rather painful and invasive mental health treatment would give, and it's especially obvious through the point of view of Istina, because she is really scared of the ECT, electroconvulsive treatment, and also leucotomy, both of which are something that she fears constantly and consistently throughout this novel. I like this novel because it really shows the kinds of fear, the kinds of apprehension that a mental health patient would probably experience when being subjected to mental health treatment at that time, because the awareness of mental health and mental illness at that time is not, it's obviously not the same as what we have, in this day and age. And so there are certain, attitudes that we would probably consider to be, backwards. And definitely, I would say, exacerbates the conditions of the mental health patients as well, because of how invasive some of those treatments are. And but at the same time, there's also this kind of consistent thing that still persists up until today, like how when you experience mental illness, you pretty much lose some control over yourself. Like you can't choose when you want to experience mental illness symptoms, and when you are placed in a mental health facility, whether whether it's voluntarily or involuntarily, you will lose more, that sense of control. You will lose more autonomy in a way, because your movements are restricted, your daily life, your routine are restricted. So it talks about all of those things also, which I think is something that still resonates with many people today. Especially those who struggle with mental illness, or those who are caring for mental health patients. Having people, loved ones who are suffering from mental illness. So I think that this is a wonderful novel about mental illness. Really recommend this one if you want to read more. A book that is very sympathetic towards mental health. I would suggest this one. It's so wonderful. It's a bit difficult to read. Let me just say that. Because some parts are kind of, maybe triggering, especially if you are triggered by mental illness or things like lobotomy, all of those things. But so those are trigger warnings for this book. Next, moving on to the third book that I finished in January, was My Sister, the Serial Killer, by Oyinkan Braithwaite. So Oyinkan Braithwaite is a Nigerian-British author, and this story takes place in modern-day Nigeria. And in it, we see a young woman named Korede. She's contacted by her sister because apparently her sister's, Iola's boyfriend, has apparently died because of supposedly self-defense. He was stabbed by Iola, and this has happened before with other boyfriends as well. And by this time, Korede is kind of like tired of it. So when her sister calls her, asking for her help to dispose of the body and clean up the crime scene, Korede just, goes and help her. So you can see that this book sort of takes a comic, darkly comic, funny kind of a tone, which feels somewhat satirical as well, and it's a very light novel. Now, the complication in this novel arises when Iola falls in love with the doctor who works at the hospital where Korede is working as a nurse. Now, the thing is, Korede is secretly in love with this doctor. And now that Iola falls in love with this doctor and the doctor reciprocates that feeling, Korede is rightfully worried. And eventually she would have to make a choice whether she would want to choose this doctor that she's in love with, or she has to choose her sister, which she has been protecting all this time. And you might think that, based on this description alone, that, the motivation behind what Korede is doing, why she keeps on protecting Iona, even though there's something suspicious going on, it's probably strange. But this book will also, it will also explore the why, the motivation behind Korede's action, what exactly, what exactly drives her to do the things that she does. And I think that this book is very entertaining, and I actually read it like within 3 hours, and so that's a very quick read. And the reason it is a quick read is also because the pacing is really fast, and the chapters are really short and really choppy, and basically, the text in this novel are quite big as well. And basically it's a very, very short novel. But I would say that it's a very relaxing and entertaining read, but definitely contains some triggers as well, things like violence and gore and blood, obviously, because, there's serial killer in the title, but it will also delve into topics such as abuse. And not gonna give you a lot of spoilers, so I'm gonna stop talking about this novel. But I do have a single book video about this novel. I put the link in the description box below. So next one, the fourth, is Follow Your Heart by Susanna Tamaro, who is an Italian author, and this book was originally written in Italian and was translated into English by Avril Bardoni. And so this book is quite interesting because I've never heard of it before, and I just saw it at a bookstore and I was like, okay, I've never heard of this book, let's just grab it. And so this book is sort of written as a series of letters written by an elderly woman. Her name is Olga, and she lives in a small town in Italy. And these letters that Olga is writing, the letters are intended to her granddaughter, who left home a few years ago, when their relationship sort of becoming a bit strained. Not necessarily because of some big events or whatever, but it just became strained because of their age differences, generational gap. And in these letters, Olga talks about the things that sort of happened to her in her past, from her childhood, when she was a young woman, when she was an older woman, and all of the choices and the mistakes, the things that she has done, and she talks about it all in these letters and dedicated to her granddaughter. She does not intend to send these letters to her granddaughter, but rather she's writing it with the idea that the biggest grief that one can experience is when one loses the opportunity to say what one wants to say to another person when that person is gone. So it's like this loss of chance and opportunity to communicate that is the biggest grief, and that sort of motivates her to write these letters. And I would say that these letters that Olga is writing can sort of be read as if they are some kind of self-help book containing some gems of wisdom, but I think that kind of reading would probably take away a bit from the fictional, or rather novelistic aspect of this book, because Olga herself is still a character, and as she's writing all of these, she is still a character, the protagonist in this novel. And to me, I thought that this book is quite positive. Olga herself is a person who has made mistakes, who is a flawed character, but the way that the writing is done here is quite empathetic. It is it is it is non-judgmental, and when you read it, you feel like you're welcome into this novel. And yeah, it's a wonderful novel. I gave it 4 stars, and I would definitely recommend it. Apparently, this novel was like a success as well when it was published sometime in 1994, but I was only 1 year old at that time, so I wasn't really aware of the Italian literature scene. So, anyway, moving on to the next book that I finished. It was The Nakano Thrift Shop by Hiromi Kawakami. So this book was originally written in Japanese, and it was translated into English by Alison Markin Powell. So, I have some thoughts about this book. Now, of course, I explored more of these thoughts in my single book video about this book, so I'm not going to talk in great detail over here, but I must say that, I had some kind of preconceived notion about this book, because apparently, it's about a thrift shop, and I look at the chapter headings, they're all about, objects, and I thought that it was going to be like whimsical sort of a book, and I was wrong. This book is not whimsical at all. And, I personally think that, in hindsight, it is sort of unfair for me to expect that this book would be a whimsical kind of a novel, because it can be anything, right? It can literally be anything. It doesn't have to be whimsical. And so I was somewhat pleased that it wasn't a whimsical novel. It subverted my expectation. So what happens in here is that we have this protagonist who works at a thrift shop owned by one Mr. Nakano, and the protagonist's name is Hitomi. So she's a young woman, and basically we follows Hitomi and her boss, Mr. Nakano, and also Hitomi's co-worker, I think his name is Takeo, if I'm not mistaken, and also Mr. Nakano's Masayo. So these are the 4 characters who sort of, are the constant presences in this thrift shop, and we sort of see their daily life while tending to the shop, dealing with customers and stuff like that. And that aspect of this novel is not exactly like the plot of it, and so but it makes up a major chunk of this novel, so it sort of has this slice of life feel to it. There is a sort of like a main plot in this novel involving the protagonist, which is about how Hitomi, how she pursues a romantic relationship with her co-worker in the thrift shop. And this book sort of follows, from beginning to the end, how Hitomi deals with, starting a relationship with him, and how they navigate through this relationship, and what, how the relationship it develops. But what I feel from that is that the relationship itself, it reeks of toxicity. It's a very difficult relationship to read, and there is a lot of kind of like lack of communication between these 2 persons who are supposedly in a relationship. And when you read that relationship, it feels kind of awkward and and jarring. And so I didn't really enjoy that part of this novel, not necessarily because it is about a difficult relationship, but because of how it feels sort of static. Much of this novel has that sort of slowness, which I like, but it also feels static, which I don't particularly like. So if you're interested in the book that is about kind of like a slice of life kind of writing about life in a small part of Japan, And if you enjoy something that is slow, I would definitely recommend the Nakano Thrift Shop. But if you're interested in something, in a story that is about relationship that is interesting, in which some sort of drama happens, then I would not recommend this book for you. So, hi again. I just paused this video to charge some, electronic device. And let's return to this wrap-up video. And the next book I finished was Tin Man by Sarah Winman. So this book is, it takes place in Oxford, England, and it's about this relationship between three people, Ellis, Michael, and Annie. Now, Ellis and Michael, they grew up together as kids, and they became very good friends. They are very close to one another, and eventually their friendship sort of develops into something that is more than that. They became romantically interested in one another. Now, one of the small conflicts, or rather internal conflicts, happened when Ellis, who sort of grew up in this kind of abusive household, especially since his father isn't exactly the most tender person in the world, and Ellis eventually has this kind of like doubts about his own sexuality, and that influences his relationship with Michael, who is an openly gay person. And when they are slightly older, Annie came into the picture, and eventually Ellis marries, starts a relationship with Annie and marries her. And but all of these these three individuals still remains friends with one another, but there is already some kind of sense of discomfort, you would say, that sort of exists between these individuals, even though they're still friends. So this book sort of explores like what happens after that, and it is sort of like Ellis' own reflection on how he sees the relationship. And this book is also about loss, and it's about grief and how one deals with that. I am not going to talk more about what sort of happens to these people and their relationship. There are definitely more about that. Half of the book is pretty much about what happens to these people. So not gonna go into spoilery territory, but I must say that even though this book is sort of marketed as a book that is about this three-way relationship, which I think in concept is very interesting, it's a really nice concept. At the same time, I feel like the book focuses more on the relationship between Michael and Ellis, and not so much on Annie. And it doesn't really show in great detail what are the feelings that Annie and Ellis have between for each other. They're married, yeah, so but it doesn't really go into great detail, and doesn't really show in great detail how Ellis feels about Michael. They are friends. That one we know from the synopsis at the back, but it doesn't really go very deeply into that. So I find it really strange when it says that it's about a love triangle of sorts. That is not exactly a love triangle, but still it doesn't really go in great depth when it comes to this character of Annie. She's like this really shadowy character in the background who is friends with both of these men, and I just find that to be somewhat lacking, and I would love to know more about what goes on with Annie, and not just this homosexual relationship between these two men. And definitely a lot more that could be explored in this book, but overall I thought that it was a decently written book. So the next book that I finished was Madonna in a Fur Coat by Sabahattin Ali, and this book was originally written in Turkish, and it was translated into English by Maureen Freely and Alexander Dole. And okay, this book is interesting. I actually started out liking this book. So this book is about this young man. His name is Raif. He's from Turkey. And, the story takes place in the earlier half of the 20th century. And so Raif comes from a fairly rich family in Turkey, and he goes to Germany to sort of studies, the industry, the soap making industry that his family is dealing with. So that's his purpose to Germany. He goes to study, and in Germany, he encounters this portrait of a woman, this so eponymous Madonna in a fur coat, and he falls in love with the image of this portrait, this self-portrait, by the way. And he eventually meets this woman, the painter. Her name is Maria, and he is passionately in love with Maria. Now, a bit of background about these characters. Raif is someone who is very quiet and meek and shy, and he's introverted. He's so much gravitated towards the arts, the literature, and he is not exactly like super interested with the soap making industry that his family is doing. And when he meets Maria is someone who is very capricious, full of energy, and she is honest about herself, and she's honest to other people. Like, she just says what she wants to say. Like, in modern terms, she's keeping it real. And so we have these two very opposing people with opposing traits. Just sort of, the guy falls in love with this woman, but Maria does not reciprocate his feeling. And they eventually sort of, become friends, but you could certainly sense that there is some kind of unease, some kind of tension that happens between these two people who keep on calling each other, each other's best friends, BFF. They go to walks and, go to parties and stuff like that. And I think that, the way that this book actually sort of progresses, it's interesting, especially in the beginning, in which we see this character of Maria, who is written as this like really strong female character, which I find to be fairly aspirational. She certainly has this aspirational vibe to her, especially especially considering that this book was written around the early parts of 20th century. She feels very progressive for her time, and so I thought that it was really interesting when juxtaposed with this protagonist who is very shy and meek, and I like the dynamics. I like this uneasiness that happens between them, this discomfort. But something happens in the latter part of this book, the latter half of it, that just completely destroys Maria's character. Like, it just crushes all of the great things about her and turns her into this like really lame, badly written character, and it really affects this whole story. It affects the journey of this protagonist, which I thought was going towards a particular direction, but turns out it took another direction that really miffed me. Like, I was so disappointed by the ending of this book. I have a rant video about this book, so if you are interested, you can check that out. But oh my gosh, that... Moving on to the next book that I finished, Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Kawaguchi Toshikazu, or rather in Western convention, Toshikazu Kawaguchi. And this book was originally written in Japanese. It was translated into English by George Trusselot. And this book it has a very interesting premise. So basically, it centers around this cafe in Tokyo, in which there is a particular corner in this cafe that allows the patron to sort of travel through time and kind of experience that whole time traveling, and where they get to sort of revisit what happens in the past and sort of interacts with the past. And this book, this novel, it actually takes the form of kind of like 4 vignettes in which it explores 4 different characters traveling through time and trying to deal with certain aspects of their life, like past regrets and certain kind of loss, dealing with loss, and basically the things that motivates them to go back in time and see if they can change anything or not. Now, one of the time travel in this book definitely has a lot of rules, but one of the more interesting rule is, of course, in the title, that the time travelers have to get back to the present time before their coffee gets cold, which is a super arbitrary rule. Like, how do you determine how the coffee gets cold? And that is actually referenced in this novel as well by one of the characters. Overall, I thought that this book, like I said, the premise is interesting, but I feel that as a light novel, it sort of works. It's a quick read as well, but I do find that certain elements in this book feels very repetitive, like how the rules are being repeated to different characters, which, kind of makes sense, but we readers have seen the rules, before, and we see it again, and it's sort of, it disturbs the flow of this book. It makes it feel kind of clunky, you know what I mean? And the story also feels like a very, it relies mostly on the reader's emotional reaction, especially considering that, the characters deal with, stuff like grief and loss and regrets. But in a way, it feels like a Hallmark movie, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there is so much reliance on eliciting this emotional response from the readers. Like, there is nothing much beyond that, So I give it 3 stars. It's a fairly okay written novel, so definitely something that you can pick up if you want to read something a bit more relaxing, not particularly demanding. So, moving on to my last 3 books. Yay! Next one is I Am China by Xiao Luguo, and I love this book. This book is probably my first 5-star reads in 2022. So, yay! So, I Am China is actually a book about, it centers around this protagonist named Iona. So, Iona is a Scottish translator. She lives in London, I think, and one day she receives like a bundle of diary entries and also letters from a publishing company, and the publishing company wants her to translate these diaries and letters so that they can sort of be compiled and made into a book. And as she reads these diaries and all of these papers, she finds out that these are written by 2 different people from China. And these 2 persons, they are actually sort of each other's paramour. Like, they are in a relationship. So one of the names is Jian, a guy, and the other one is a woman named Mu. And so Jian and Mu are so passionate towards one another romantically, but at the same time, Jian and Mu are also politically passionate, and it is because of their political passion that sort of leads to Jian and Mu being physically separated from one another. Now, how does that happen? Of course, I'm not going to say it. I'm going to be as vague as possible. But it feels very compelling because even though after they separate from one another, the correspondence continues, and we sort of follows as Iona translates their letters to us in a way, and to herself, of course, in universe, to her publisher, but she also translates the letters to us. We sort of see and follow Jian and Mu's story in China and how they sort of engage politically with their their environment and things that the causes that they are standing up for. It's really compelling, and in story, Iona is so invested with the writings that these individuals have done. And but eventually all the documents are, she exhausted all of the documents, she finished translate all of them, but the story is not done yet, and so it sort of prompts Iona to embark on an adventure to track these individuals to see if their story still continues, and I really like this sort of adventure feel to it. There is almost this kind of like fantasy feel to it as well, this kind of urban fantasy in which a character sort of goes on an adventure to track down people who are supposedly, culturally distant from you, and turns out maybe they are not that far away from you after all, and there is this kind of like really nice element of cultural intersection in here. I really like how these characters just sort of engage in different culture, like how the Chinese characters, Jian and Mu, not only they're confined to their Chinese societies, but when they're separated from one another, they also go on their own personal adventures to different lands and different cultures as well, and that is so interesting. I really love it, and you get to be you get to be invested with two different plot lines, Jian and Mu's story and Iona's own story in tracking down these two individuals and see if their story would conclude in a particular way. So I really like it. The form of this novel is also very nice. I like how it uses translation to convey this sense of as if it's like an analogy of bridging different cultures, because that's essentially what translation does. A good translation would be able to sort of connect different cultures, people from different cultures. So I think that is really interesting. It brings out that idea in this novel, and it that idea just feels really alive in here. So really awesome stuff. 5-star reads. I have a full video raving about it. Next one is something that I want to rant about, or rather I actually ranted about it in a video, and that is The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. So this book is a sequel of The Handmaid's Tale, and so okay, this book is being told through different protagonists. So we have the first point of view, an aunt who is a high-ranking member in the administration of the highly repressive totalitarian state of Gilead, in which where women do not have rights. And so we have an aunt, her name is Aunt Lydia, and she controls like part of the administration and the government in Gilead that concerns mostly with women's affairs. And Aunt Lydia in this novel, she has a particular agenda. And as we follow her, we find out what her agenda is. And I would say that her agenda is kind of interesting. At the same time, we also get to hear the point of view of two young women. One young woman is named Agnes Jemima, and she is preparing for her role as as a young woman in the society of Gilead, and she wants certain things, but because she's a woman in Gilead, doesn't mean that she can get what she wants, and we sort of follows her as she ends up on becoming a particular position in Gilead. And the other protagonist is a young woman, a teenager, I would say, named Daisy. And Daisy is a teenager living in Canada, and apparently she has some kind of mysterious connection to Gilead. I wonder what that is. And eventually all of their paths all converge into one later in this book. And I would say, at least for Aunt Lydia's and Agnes's narrations, those sound very consistent with the theme of the universe of The Handmaid's Tale, which is a very bleak and sort of gloomy and dark kind of a story. And their stories feels very consistent. Their story conveys the right sense of gravity that one could associate with this kind of government, the state. Whereas the narration of Daisy, who is from Canada, maybe she's from Canada, she's from outside of that state. So maybe that's why she sounds really oblivious towards the stake at hand, towards the gravity of the situation. She sounds so flippant in this novel. She sounds so angsty. She is so edgy. She sounds like a badly written YA dystopian protagonist. Keyword on badly written. And that's another thing. Like, I find it really strange that this book feels like it's partly adult fiction, partly YA fiction. Like, if you want to make this novel entirely YA fiction, that's totally fine. Or another choice is to make it an entirely adult fiction, which is also fine, as long as you get consistent with it. But if you end up making it partly adult, partly YA, it feels very confused, and it just disrupts the flow, of the story. Each time you read a different narration, you realize that you're reading fiction. Meaning you're yanked out of the narration, you're yanked out of the story, and that is a bad experience. So this book is so weird. So lastly is All Russians Love Birch Trees by Olga Grasnova, and this book was translated from German into English by Eva Bacon. So this book centers around this character named Masha, and Masha is a young Russian Jewish woman living in Frankfurt in Germany. So as a child, Masha had actually escaped genocidal war in Azerbaijan from where her family is from, and she escaped that together with her parents and the rest of her family, and that sort of left a particularly, I would say, indelible memory in her, and it sort of becomes something that she carries with her as she grew up into a young woman with her own career and her being successful in her studies. And she seems like a well-adjusted woman until her German boyfriend dies. And when that happens, she grieves, and then she realizes that her grief or rather grief in general, is not something that she is particularly well equipped to deal with, considering the traumatic events that she has experienced as a child in Azerbaijan. And she sort of learns that grief is something that she still needs to process. And at the same time, she is living as a sort of an immigrant in modern day Germany, and her friends are all of different immigrant backgrounds. And this book also tackles the issues of racism, immigration, identity, nationalism, and multiculturalism in modern day Europe, specifically in Germany. And how all of those things sort of introduce more complications in Masha's own personal life, and also how she how she navigates her own experience dealing with personal grief and also collective grief, family grief. I find that this book to be I think it is decently written. There are parts of this book that are injected with some humor, which I feel doesn't, the humor doesn't exactly land. But at the same time, I feel that it is also sort of in line with the main character's own, sort of desire to cope with grief that she doesn't really acknowledge, but at the same time she's not really coping with it well, and so she sort of masks it with some humor that hopefully would help things, but doesn't exactly feel very pointed and funny and all that. And so there's this kind of it sort of mirrors the protagonist's own way of this very, I would say, blunt and ineffective way in dealing with her own grief. So I think in a way I sort of appreciate that, but as a whole I think that this novel it's not something I would consider as particularly stellar. That being said, I do like the ending. There is something about the ending that sort of just feels kind of, all of those things, all of the elements that are being set up at the beginning of this book, they are all just sort of culminate into this moment that feels very cinematic in the end. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about what happens at the end, but I do feel that the ending of this book feels fairly dramatic, and it is dramatic in a good way. So if you are interested in reading a book that sort of deals with issues like racism and racism felt by immigrants, and this sense of loss of identity and home in Europe, I would suggest this book. And it's a really it's a slightly different interpretation of the story of immigration than what we usually see, because this is a book that sort of tackles immigration not in a way that the final destination is where most of the story happens. The final destination is sort of being seen as the finishing line, in which you can either try best to make it and deal with the challenges there. This book also deals with the starting point, like the loss of your home, and how that actually defines the immigration experience. And when that happens, you also lose your roots, you lose your origin, and it may feel sort of disorienting, especially when you go to a new place and people in a new place says that you don't belong there. So where the hell do you belong? Actually, you end up asking yourself that. So this book asks that kind of question. So I find it kind of interesting if you look at it from that perspective. So those are all of the books that I finished in January. And I don't think that I'll be able to replicate 11 books afterwards. We'll see what happens, but definitely not in February. Because in February I have plans to read fairly long books. I have this one, Fall on Your Knees by Anne-Marie MacDonald, which is about 500 pages. This one by Sarah Waters, Tipping the Velvet. I know some of you guys would say that, oh, this is a puny number, you know, it's 400 pages. For me, it's long. I am also reading this one by Pachinko. No, by Minjin Lee. It's called Pachinko. And this is 500 pages. And the longest book that I really want to read, and I must say, I'm so excited by this. I saw it at the bookstore. I was like, oh my gosh, get it. And this is by Sigurd Undset's Kristin Lavransdatter. This is the longest one that I have. It's 1,000 pages. But to be fair, it's actually a collection of 3 different books. But of course, if I were to register on my Goodreads, it would count as one book. But who cares about Goodreads goals? Anyway, that's all for my wrap-up video. I realized that it's nearly 1 hour. Oh my gosh, you really need to make use of that timestamp then. Anyway, I'll see you again in the in the next video. So until then, take care. Thanks for watching, and bye.